What's up, guys, and welcome back to the Diablo 3 how-to guide. This one is going to be about hopefully answering your questions about what is a good piece of gear for each different slot that there is on a character. And also when you see a piece of gear drop, what has potential to becoming something good. Now, obviously, a lot of builds are different in Diablo 3, and a lot of builds are using different stats, but this video I'm going to cover general stats that you would really kind of want to look for on each of the slots that would deem them decent or good, right? And also I'll go through, like, looking at a piece of gear, if it drops, like, based on how the stats are, if it can become decent, right? So bear with me. It's going to be a fairly long video as I, kind of go through all these gear slots, but I'll try to do so in kind of a timely manner. All right, so we're going to start off with the Helm, right? The Helm is one of those pieces that I like to consider a offensive piece because, you want primary stat on this. You can also have armor, vitality, which gives you some survivability. But more importantly, what you really want is you want main stat, vitality or armor, and then you want crit and or a skill. For some builds where you can have spender skills on here, you can have things like, for the Demon Hunter, you can have like multi-shot damage and stuff like that. So, if you ever have a question, you can always actually go to the Mystic and click on this little question mark here, and you can see all the potential stats that can be replaced by this one. So see, if I didn't want crit on here, I could have any of these spender skills. So like if this was a UE, Unhallowed Essence Helm, this could be multi-shot 15, and it also could be strafe, elemental arrow, and stuff like that. And there are some builds where you might want, crit, or, a skill over crit or something in that regard. So if something drops that has like your primary stat, and then it has crit already, and then maybe one other thing, you could potentially make this really decent by just replacing the ability or the stat that isn't useful for your build into crit, a skill or a skill up percentage attribute or something like that to make it decent. Moving on to the shoulders, I consider the shoulders to be a utility piece, where most of the time with most builds you're going to want primary stat, vitality, resistance to all elements, cooldown reduction, and things like that. Some builds that use area damage, you'll probably want area damage on here as well. Like if it's a build that's not going to use CDR, then you would just swap, instead of looking for cooldown reduction, you'd want like area damage, for instance, right? And so the shoulders are usually just like a good utility piece. All right, moving on to the gloves. This is another piece that I consider to be offensive because most of the time you're going to want crit damage, crit chance, vitality, dexterity. And if you are a build that uses a lot of attack speed, then you probably just swap out vitality for attack speed and or cooldown reduction. But most of the time, a decent glove is going to be primary stat, crit, and then IAS, which is attack speed, and or cooldown reduction, or just life. But crit on gloves is pretty good. Going over the chest piece would be probably a defensive piece. Most of the time it's going to have, a good piece is going to have primary stat, and then it's going to have vitality or, life percentage, and then reduced damage from elites is really good as well. There are some chest pieces that I can actually roll skills as well. So if you look at here, you can actually swap the damage from elites for things like companion, phantom knives, more, hatred spenders or more spending skills for that matter. But most of the time, a good chest piece, like I said, primary stat, life, or some sort of like vitality, life percentage, and then damage from elites. Going over the amulet, amulets and rings are kind of in the same arena for the most part. You're absolutely always going to want a socket on your jewelry pieces because you want to have your legendary gems equipped. In my opinion, I consider a good ring or amulet to be good when it has a socket, crit chance, crit damage, and then usually main stat or something like that. The one exception here is with an amulet, I would say a really, really, really good amulet would have elemental damage, crit chance, and a socket. And what elemental damage really means on this is you're going to have like it's something that would have like cold skills, deal more damage, fire, lightning, stuff like that. And you want to align that to whatever your primary damage dealer. So for like the God DH, you definitely want like cold damage percentage on that. And I would consider that a really, really good Amulet. For the belt's another like utility piece. Some belts differ, like, Witching Hour can have crit damage on it. It's one of the only pieces that can. But, you're going to have main stat, vitality, armor, and then also a generator skill damage, right? So it's really good for the God DH to have Hungering Arrow here because that's our main damage dealer. But the other ones you can have are like grenades and Tangling Shot. These are all things that generate resources instead of spending. And like I said, with the amulet, your good ring, a good ring would have crit socket, or if your build uses attack speed or you need more CDR, you might want to put attack speed on it as well. But most of the time, a crit damage, crit chance socket ring would be considered really, really good. Going on to the pants is also a slot that I consider to be defensive as well. It can give primary stat, usually vitality, life percentage, all res, but in the case of this, you can also roll generator skill percentage bonuses on them as well. So like this one has Hungering Arrow. And the one thing about pants are in almost anything is if you have a physical resistance in the secondary, it will not be able to roll all res in the primary. So a really, really good pair of pants wouldn't have any sort of resistance in its secondary abilities. And it would allow you to actually roll it into something like, Dex, all res, or like something like if you didn't need the skill generator percentage bonus, you'd want something like Dex, Vitality, all res. That'd be a good pair of pants. For the God DH, we have enough damage mitigation that this is actually very decent. Dex, Vitality, and then Hungering Arrow, very good. Moving on to the boots. The boots are another like offensive piece, or defensive piece rather. So most of the time, your boots are going to have your primary stat, Vitality. You want all res and armor, unless you need the spender skill percentage. So the boots are one of those slots that are actually you can roll spender skill percentage on, like multi-shot, strafe, and things like that. It's exact opposite of what like the pants are that can roll generator skill percentages. For bracers are kind of a utility piece as well. They're for almost every build that I've used in Diablo 3, they're generally about the same. Dex, Vitality, and then crit, followed by your elemental damage percentage. So for instance, this build uses Hungering Arrow, Devouring Arrow, which is cold damage. So for our bracers, we have cold damage 20 on them because that would actually increase the damage of our Hungering Arrow. If you're using a fire skill, you want that to be fire damage, but a good bracer would have your elemental damage, your primary stat, your vitality, and your crit chance. Moving on to offhands. Offhands are kind of very difficult to get just right, just because of how the RNG works. But for the most part, you're kind of putting a lot of things on here. Sort of like your shoulders, they're going to be a utility piece, but more on the damage side of things, right? So I would consider a really good like offhand, especially like a quiver, to be like primary stat, vitality, attack speed, and crit chance. With for instance, this build has Hungering Arrow, so it's some offhands can have generator, some can have spender percentages on them. But you're gonna try to fill in some gaps here on your stats as well, depending on what your build needs. So you're gonna be looking for things like cooldown reduction or attack speed, things like that, or even more area damage, right? So look at the offhand as like a way to kind of fill in the gaps on some of those abilities. All right, now moving on to the weapon, probably the most important one, right? The weapon, you should never, ever, ever roll a socket onto it. Absolutely never, because you can use a gift to add an additional socket to the weapon without actually having to sacrifice one of the other stats on it. The weapon should always be something that's related to your build, obviously. So like this one, I use this for resource cost reduction and it has area damage on it. For other builds, you might need cooldown reduction here or attack speed. Another thing about the weapon too is if it's ancient, that's going to be a significant damage increase. So one of your main goals when building your character is to make sure you try to at least get your weapon to be ancient, because that's going to give you a substantial amount of DPS increase. So always be looking at what your build does. So if it's a build that uses a lot of CDR, you're probably going to try to get CDR on a lot of your gear to get to a certain breakpoint. Or if it's like something that require like a monk's build that requires maybe a lot of like attack speed, you're going to try to roll attack speed on a lot of things to hit a certain breakpoint. The abilities on all your gear should be unlocking and synergizing with the abilities that your abilities need. That's how you maximize its potential, right? We'll go over like a few gear pieces, like just some random stuff. We'll look at some random gear in here, and I'll give you like have an idea of like how you would manipulate gear if it dropped. So and now that would give you the perspective, like if something drops in a rift, you look at it, look at the stats, can you actually make it better, right? So we'll try to like stay in terms of DH here. See if I find. I'll probably have to grab a primal actually, just because a lot of my sets are rolled already. So, all right, like let's see these strong arm bracers here, right? Now these are strength, vitality, regeneration, and crit, right? So this is actually a decent piece because I know we can replace this regenerate with our elemental damage, which would give us all the points that we need, right? It would give us our primary stat, our vitality, our crit, and our elemental damage, right? So if this dropped like this, I know it's good to go because I can just swap that regen 1-for-1 right to elemental. That's the kind of thing you're looking for. That's the kind of gear comparison you're looking for. So we'll look at these Mage Fist here. These dropped with dexterity, attack speed, and crit. These are actually pretty decent too because you could, if you didn't need the attack speed, just change the attack speed to crit damage. Then you're looking at having a primary stat crit resource cost reduction. Or probably what I would do if I was going to use this on a Demon Hunter, I would actually probably swap off the reduce resource cost, which I'm not sure actually that one can be taken off. Yeah, it can. So like if you look at this, you just take your like item in here, look at your resource cost. These are all things that you can potentially get, right? So to make this Mage Fist really, really good, I would just roll it until I got crit damage, right? Because then you'd be looking at a really nice crit attack speed, primary stat, right? And you can kind of see this is you can see how this is going pretty much for everything. So like Firewalkers, boots are kind of weird because they can always drop like movement speed usually. But so let's say I was gonna use these on a build that didn't use multi-shot, right? And you don't need the movement speed because if you have all your movement speed already in Paragon, you're capped out, right? So that 12% that's on these Firewalkers isn't doing anything. So in order for us to make this actually viable, we know we have to take off movement speed because we don't need it or benefit from it. But we are also then stuck with a multi-shot percentage bonus that we don't need either. So in my opinion, these boots would actually not work at all unless we were using multi-shot, right? So that would be a no-go, right? The trick is to like make sure every stat on all your gear is relevant to your build. So let's look at some shoulders. So these shoulders have, dex, vitality, armor, and then resource cost. For what these shoulders are, I'd probably keep the reduce the resource cost. You could swap armor for like all res, but this won't actually roll all res. And I'll show you. So I throw this in here. They'll go armor. See, it doesn't actually have resistance to all elements in here because the secondary is physical resistance. If this physical resistance wasn't in the secondary, then we could actually swap this armor for all res, which we can't. So that's just something that we have to live with on that. It doesn't mean this piece is bad. You could roll armor off for CDR or area damage, but most of the time I really like my shoulders to have primary stat, vitality, all res plus one other thing. Let's put those back. Looked at boots. Let's look at chests right here, like a random chest, right? Dex, vitality, and then it has a spender skill on it as well. Probably would keep you almost always. You're gonna keep the dexterity, vitality on a chest piece. But if let's looking at replacing this, skill percentage, you could swap this for resistance to all elements, which would be really really good. And you could also get reduce damage from elites, which are really good. And if you're using a build that uses any of these skills, putting that on there also makes it very good. So yeah, I would say that this piece is very potential, right? Just with one swap at the Mystic. And we'll look at some belts, right? Like usually belts are like utility pieces. So like this string of ears, dex, vit, life, armor already out the gate, so it's pretty good to go. And then you have things like Hunter's Wrath, where for Hunter's Wrath, now in today's meta, you definitely want that evasive fire to be Hungering Arrow, but you don't necessarily need that regeneration. So I would say this is if you get Hungering Arrow on it, you're just gonna have like regenerate, which is not gonna do you a whole lot of good. So it doesn't have the greatest potential, right? Because as you know, and I probably should have said this before, but you can only roll an item once, right? So once you roll a slot or a stat off of an item, you can't reset that item back to do another one, right? So you're kind of stuck with it. That's why a when you're judging gear when it drops, as long as you can move one stat that's not useful into something that is, and it makes it to where all the stats on that item are useful for your build, then it is a good candidate to try to hone in, right? Obviously, a good piece of gear is, hitting all the notes you need in every slot for your build. We'll go through a couple more of these, just like look at some weapons. So like this weapon here, it says Dex, Vitality, it has cold damage on it. Depending on what you build you're using this with, your chances are you're going to want something like damage percentage, right? Damage percentage is really good. You can see it's on my Yangs. That's usually a good to go slot or an item, a stat on a weapon. So I guess if I had to like pick, damage percentage plus primary stat plus something like, area damage, CDR, attack speed, that's going to be a really good weapon in my opinion. And then obviously when you use a gift on a weapon to add a socket, then you add crit damage to it, makes it even better. Weapons are kind of difficult to actually get just right because like this pus spitter right here, that's Dex, Vitality, and then cooldown. Yeah, we can swap the Vitality out for CDR, area damage, attack speed, or even damage plus percentage, but then you're still kind of missing what a good weapon could actually be, right? We're gonna go over here and look at my Demon Hunter here a little bit. We'll show you like a different little Yang streak over here. This says, just Dex and this just has Dex and damage percentage on it, so it's not as good as the one I have equipped because, I have the Dex and the damage on the one I have equipped plus area damage plus the resource cost reduction. So that's just, you want to try to like utilize and maximize every stat that you possibly can for everything. And like this one, like this Odyssey's End, this one we had I didn't have no idea what it had on it, but I rolled damage on it. So it has damage, primary stat, attack speed, which is decent, but probably not the best it could be, and stuff like that. It's a lot to take in, but in my experience from playing this game for many, many years, the most of the time, generally speaking, obviously, crit chance, crit damage, CDR, attack speed, and then also getting your elemental percentage and any sort of skill percentage plus on your gear is the best way to go, right? So following the stuff that I've said for each slot in this video, if you, kind of like use that as a tool to analyze and, kind of like tweak your gear, you're going to do really well, right? Hope this video was helpful in answering your questions about stats on gear in Diablo 3. And see you guys next time. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Peace out.